Welcome back to our channel. This is part 3 of our series on the 6 essential elements of the process of successfully selling a business, the offer. Now, if you watched the first video in this series, you've prepared, or at least you know how to prepare, your business and yourself for a successful sale. If you've watched the second video in this series, you've created the right marketing materials, you've put the business out there and began the marketing, you've gotten some responses, and you've begun to send out information, important, often confidential information, to what you hope are serious buyers. And all of a sudden, pow, an email arrives and the subject line says, letter of intent. Now, what is essentially an offer for your business is attached to that LOI. And all of a sudden, a little excitement breaks out. But don't pop the champagne just yet, because this is just the first stage of the most challenging aspect of selling a business. So in this video, we're going to talk about the letter of intent, what it is, what it isn't, and how to negotiate one intelligently. Because once the LOI is signed, it's almost impossible to improve the deal to the benefit of the seller. So, what is a letter of intent? Well, a letter of intent, or an LOI, is essentially an abstract of the purchase agreement. So, what is an abstract? If you haven't watched our second video in this series, an abstract is a short, concise list of specific terms and conditions contained in a longer document. The example we used in that last video was a commercial lease. A commercial lease is generally 50, 70, 80 pages long. But a good leasing agent, a considerate leasing agent, will send that lease to a potential tenant along with an abstract of the lease, 3 to 4 pages describing who the tenant is, who the landlord is, when the lease begins, when it expires, the listing amount, what the square footage is going to be, and on and on and on, without any of the boilerplate that is in the other 70 pages. An LOI is essentially the same thing. It is an abstract describing the salient points of a transaction. It does not include any of the boilerplate that will eventually be in any definitive purchase agreement. So the objective of the LOI is to open negotiations on these most important points. Remember, it's from the buyer's perspective, so it doesn't really care, it doesn't consider what the seller needs, but the objective is to get these points on the table and agreed to or negotiated before spending the time and money to get a full purchase agreement drafted. So it's rare that a buyer expects a seller to accept all of the terms and conditions listed in the LOI. Such terms are almost always starting points for the negotiations, and you, as a seller, should view them as such. The potential buyer is testing the waters. They expect a counter from you. Now, a letter of intent will almost always contain the following points and terms. The proposed purchase price. What is this buyer suggesting they'll pay for the business? The structure of the deal. Will it be an asset sale or will it be a stock sale? What are the payment terms that they're proposing? A lot of cash? All cash? Will there be some seller financing? How about an earnout? Maybe a holdback or an escrow? The timeline. When do they propose closing on the transaction? The due diligence period, a study period that will be in almost every LOI. It has to have the scope and the duration of that period. Exclusivity. Exclusivity is essentially taking your business off the market for a certain period of time. You need to understand that. I'll give more on that in a second. Confidentiality. Now, this is a big deal from your standpoint because you're going to be disclosing confidentiality and private data to a buyer. You want to make sure that none of that information gets published, none of it gets out into the public domain. Major contingencies. Maybe they need to get a permit for something. They want to add a service or product to your business. Maybe there's an environmental concern. Maybe there's a financing contingency. These contingencies will be listed in the LOI. But with the LOI, the buyer is essentially saying, if everything checks out, here's the deal we're willing to do. So it's important to remember, though, that an LOI is almost always not legally binding, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 particular aspects of the LOI. For example, confidentiality. That's binding. It's binding on the buyer so that he keeps all of your information confidential, but it's also binding on you so that you don't alert other people to the fact that this buyer is in the market, which will impact other business owners and maybe make it more challenging for the buyer to buy a business. Exclusivity. The exclusivity is essentially taking your business off the market where you're promising not to negotiate with any other buyers for a defined period of time. That's binding. And governing law. So the law of the jurisdiction where the business is located is generally the law that will govern the transaction and governs the LOI. Now, further to exclusivity. It's important to understand when you sign an LOI with exclusivity, you're typically agreeing not to negotiate with other buyers. In doing so, you're effectively taking your business off the market. So understand when that you are giving exclusivity, you're giving up leverage. Once the terms of the LOI are agreed to, there's very little chance to improve those terms or improve the deal from the seller's perspective. If you're going to give that leverage up, make sure you give it to the right buyer. Now, one of the biggest mistakes, if not the biggest mistake, we see sellers make when they receive an LOI is that they focus on the headline number. But price is only one component of value. You've got to look at other terms, all of the other terms, and see if they comport with what you need. How much cash is the buyer offering to put down? Is the buyer requiring you to take back some financing? Is there an earnout involved? An earnout generally is going to require you to continue to work for the company for a period of time to earn whatever is being held back. Is part of the purchase price contingent on something else? For example, permitting. If the buyer wants to add a product or service to your business and they need a permit to do so, they may have a contingency in the agreement that they will not pay this offered price unless they get this permit. They would pay a lower price, or they have the ability to walk away from the deal. So you need to understand if there are contingencies. You have to look and see if there's any holdback or escrows where some of the purchase price is held for the performance, say. Certain milestones need to be reached in the business's performance, and then that holdback, whatever funds are held back in escrow, would be released as those milestones are hit. Is your employment required post-closing? If so, for how long? And how is that structured? Are there any personal guarantees involved? Two offers with the same price can have vastly different outcomes. For example, we'll use a very simple example here. $1 million business. That's your target, $1 million. So you get an offer of $950,000. Actually, you get 2 offers of $950,000. And you're able to negotiate one up to $980 and the other up to $975. The $975 is cash at closing, $975,000. The $980,000 has got a $250,000 holdback, an earnout, and you have to work for 2 years to hit certain milestones in revenues or earnings before you get that other $250,000. Those are 2 completely different outcomes for what are essentially offers at the same price. Price is only one component of value. Now remember, our definition of success from our first video is comprised of three things. We want the highest possible value for the business. We want to achieve it in the shortest possible time. And we want to achieve it with the least oppressive terms. Any LOI that you receive has got to be analyzed and evaluated through that lens. So, how do you respond to an LOI? First, you don't respond, you don't react emotionally. Second, you don't react immediately. And third, you don't accept it. Period. No matter how attractive it is. An LOI is the opening salvo of this process. Even if the offer states that this is the best the buyer can do, I guarantee you that the buyer can do better. Whatever that initial offer states, the buyer expects you to counter. It's important to remember that many, if not all, of the terms and conditions of the initial offer will be renegotiated during due diligence. So you want to try and get the LOI tilted in your favor as much as possible right from the get-go, because it's going to be very challenging to get better terms when things begin to happen in renegotiation. So the proper approach to this is these three steps. Review the LOI carefully, but review it with somebody who has gone through this process, somebody who has sold a similarly sized business, or find a professional business broker, a CBI, a certified business intermediary, an M&A specialist and advisor, or a transaction attorney. Review the LOI carefully with someone who knows what they're doing and has experience in this. Second, compare this LOI against both your valuation and your objectives. We touched on this earlier. Your valuation may be $1 million, and you may get an offer for $975,000 that essentially hits your valuation. You may get an offer for $1.2 million as well, which exceeds your valuation. So your valuation is met by both those offers. But if the first offer is cash at closing, the second offer requires you to stay on, but your objective is to get on a boat in San Diego and sail to Tahiti 3 days after closing, the second offer does not meet your objective. You've got to compare the offer against your valuation and your objectives. And number 3, respond with revisions. Prepare a counterorder and respond in a timely manner, trying to get the deal tilted in your favor to the extent possible. Now understand this, once you sign an LOI, your leverage declines significantly. Your signature indicates acceptance of all the terms presented by the seller that you've modified, as well as the terms that were not modified. Until then, you have still some options. Now, here are the areas that deserve the most attention. Deal structure. Remember, deal structure is more important than price. If the structure is wrong, the price doesn't matter. We just talked about the trip to Tahiti. That should give you an example. So you want to push for maximum cash at closing, minimal contingencies, and realistic earn-out metrics. So if there's an earn-out that's part of this deal and you're required to stay in to get the last $200,000 or $500,000 of the business value, make sure that the milestones that you have to meet to get that additional capital are easily gotten, are certainly within reach. Number 2, due diligence timeline. Buyers love long diligence periods, but long timelines create problems for sellers. Fatigue, After a while, you are going to be very tired of the due diligence process. So tired that there's a good chance that you'll begin to concede on certain terms that you don't need to concede. Fatigue hurts sellers. Risk of business disruption. If you've got people running around your business, going through your checkbook, going through your invoices, going through your contracts, taking inventory, bothering your people, your employees are going to be tired. They'll be disrupted. Their work is disrupted. Your business will be disrupted. You have to limit that. And renegotiation leverage. The more tired you get, the more disruption there is in your business, the less you're going to want to negotiate. You will concede. You'll accept new terms and conditions that don't reflect what you really want. The shorter the timeline, the more protection for the seller. Number 3, exclusivity. If you're granting exclusivity, limit the time frame for a defined period. It might be as small as 2 weeks, but it might be as long as the due diligence period. But it has to have a sunset. No question about it. Require active progress during this exclusivity period. So if they want to go through all the invoices, they have to have a time frame to do that. And as long as they're going through and meeting their time frames on these particular aspects of due diligence, then you're okay. You're making progress, and they understand the need to get finished with this process by such and such a date. But they might need some extensions, particularly in the case of the permit. If they need a permit, there is no way that they can control the permitting authorities. So they may need an extension both to the exclusivity period and maybe even to due diligence. Make sure those extensions are timed and tied to measurable milestones. And 4th, clarity of terms. Ambiguity at the LOI period is a disaster for sellers. If something is vague, it will almost certainly be interpreted in favor of the buyer during due diligence. You need to have it clear. Spell it out now as clearly as possible. Now, here's something very important to remember. Most business owners and most sellers aren't aware that this is going to happen, but it is. The terms, almost every term in the initial LOI are going to be renegotiated during due diligence. That's life. Due diligence, the 4th essential element of selling a business and the subject of our next video, is a deep dive into nearly everything: financials, contracts, customers, clients, employees, risk assessment, compliance, liabilities, anything that the buyer can think of that they want to dive into is going to be part of this process. And if anything differs from what the buyer expected, the buyer will attempt to adjust price and terms. Structure, escrows, holdbacks, how the price will be paid, earnouts, closing date, all of this is subject to be changed. But this is normal. But how much these terms change depends on how seriously you followed what we discussed in the first 2 videos of this series. We want to make the due diligence period one of confirmation rather than one of discovery. The more you adhere to that objective, the more closely the final deal will resemble the original letter of intent. So this objective reinforces 2 things: why your marketing materials must be a stellar exercise in full disclosure and transparency, and why the LOI must be negotiated carefully at the outset. So here are 4 caveats. Number 1, the exclusivity period. This is the period during which the seller must freeze any negotiations and marketing for their business, effectively taking it off the market. This is referred to as a no-shop clause, but it must have a clearly stated ending, known as a sunset term. It could be 10 days, it could be 120 days, and it could be the length of the due diligence period. but it has to have a sunset, because otherwise, and we've seen this, the buyer can just drag this out and nothing gets done for months. Caveat number 2. You have to go into this knowing that the purchase price is subject to change at least through the due diligence period, and often beyond that. Buyers are notorious for trying to make last-minute changes because they suspect that you're tired of this entire process and you just want it to be over with. But recognize that at this late hour, you can really hold firm because the buyer has just as much time, energy, and probably more money invested in this process at this point than you do. Caveat number 3. The closing date is never more than a vague guess on the part of the buyer and a hope on the part of the seller. It will almost always be different than that stated in the LOI, and it will in many cases be different than that stated in the final purchase agreement. And finally, caveat number 4. We always want a statement in the LOI that binds the parties to operate and work and negotiate in good faith to get a definitive purchase agreement on the table for negotiation by a date certain. We want the onus to be on the buyer to draft a purchase agreement and get it to the seller within a certain period of time, recognizing that the definitive purchase agreement can also be negotiated and will also be negotiated. But we need to have the parties commit to that, and we want that commitment in the LOI. Now, for many really small businesses, a buyer will forego the LOI and just provide and produce and present a purchase agreement. But it doesn't matter if this looks more serious. The same evaluation principles apply. What is the structure? What are the conditions? What are the indemnifications? Are there any escrows required or holdbacks? What are the payment terms? And most importantly, the representations and warranties. That section alone can protect you or leave you wide open from or to future legal liabilities post-closing. The formality of the document does not change the need to understand your options and to negotiate. Now, there's a psychological component to all of this, of course. When an LOI lands, a seller often says, well, I got a deal. You don't have a deal. You don't have anything close to a deal. At best, you have an overview of an outline of a framework of a possible deal. Until due diligence is completed and definitive agreements are signed, you've got nothing. Nothing is final. So here's the bottom line. An LOI is no more than a starting point for the most challenging stage of the process of selling a business, and it's always a bit squishy. But the squishier it is, the more it benefits the buyer. When selling a business, sellers must realize that buyers, not surprisingly, tend to take advantage of this squishiness, primarily because if there's an exclusivity period, they have effective control over the business, at least vis-a-vis the sale of the business. Hence the need for a sunset date on the exclusivity period. Remember these 4 key points. Price is only part of value. Exclusivity is leverage that you're giving up. Do so carefully. Overall deal structure determines the outcome. Structure is more important than price. And renegotiation during due diligence is not only likely, it is almost certain. So in our next video, the 4th essential element, we break down due diligence. What buyers look for, why deals fall apart, how to make the process easier for yourself, and how to reduce renegotiation. So subscribe so you don't miss that very important aspect of this process. In the description below, I've linked to every video and blog mentioned in this video, as well as to other valuable resources on valuing and selling businesses. Got a question? or a comment, put them in the description below. I'll answer every one of them. If you found this video helpful, hit that like button. It would help us out. And don't forget to subscribe. And finally, as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.